The committee met every Thursday morning. It was a small group. 6 women, sometimes 7, gathered around a long table in the back room of St. Clement's Parish Hall to organize donations, arrange visits to the poor houses, divide up the week's work. Margaret had been coming for 2 years. She knew the table, she knew the women. She knew exactly which chair creaked and which window let in a draft, and how Mrs. Pemberton always arrived 7 minutes late and always had a reason. It was ordinary, reliable. Margaret liked ordinary and reliable. She had learned to. She was pouring her tea when the door opened. A young woman stepped in. Pretty, genuinely pretty, the kind that didn't seem to know it yet. Dark coat, slightly too formal for a Thursday morning charity committee, the look of someone who had dressed carefully because she wasn't sure what to expect. She was holding her gloves in both hands and looking around the room with those eyes people have when they are new somewhere and trying very hard not to show it. Mrs. Pemberton, who had for once arrived on time, stood up immediately. "Oh, you must be the new arrival. Come in, we don't bite." The young woman smiled, relieved. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure I had the right address." "Sit anywhere you like, dear. We're very informal here." Mrs. Pemberton gestured broadly at the table. "Introduce yourself? Go on." The young woman looked around the table, found a chair, sat. "My name is Isabel," she said. "Isabel Harwood. My husband and I have just arrived from London. We've taken the Calloway house on Renton Street for the season." She paused. "I don't know anyone here yet. Someone mentioned the committee, and I thought I should find something useful to do." Margaret's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. Harwood. The room kept going around her. Mrs. Pemberton saying how wonderful, how lovely, we're so glad you've come. And Margaret sat very still for exactly 2 seconds. Then she set the teacup down, very carefully, without a sound. She looked at the young woman across the table. Isabel. Dark eyes, nervous hands, genuinely trying. 22 perhaps, 23 at most. Margaret looked at her for 1 moment longer than she should have. Then she smiled. "Welcome," she said. "We're glad to have you. Let me tell you about Margaret first. Because to understand this story, really understand it, you need to know who she was before that Thursday morning, what she had carried, how long she had been carrying it. Margaret Ellison was 28 years old. In London, in 1874, that meant something specific. It meant that at every dinner party, at every social gathering, at every Sunday church service, there was a particular kind of look she received from certain women. Not unkind, exactly. Worse than unkind. Sympathetic. The slow, careful look that said, "What a shame. She was pretty enough." What do you suppose happened? What happened, of course, was James. But nobody knew that. Not really. Not the full truth of it. What people knew was this. Margaret Ellison had never married. She had been out in society for several years, had been considered a promising match at one point, and then nothing. No engagement, no announcement, no explanation. Just Margaret, getting a little older every season, showing up at the same events in the same careful dresses, perfectly pleasant, perfectly composed, giving nothing away. She must be too particular, some said. Or perhaps there was someone who didn't work out, said others, with that tone that meant they thought they knew more than they did. 28, said Mrs. Hartley. At a dinner Margaret was not attending but would hear about later. Nearly 30. At that point, dear, one simply has to be realistic. Margaret had heard variations of this her entire life. She had developed, over years, a very precise way of receiving it. A small smile, a slight inclination of the head, A change of subject so smooth that the other person rarely noticed it had happened. She was good at that, at making things smooth, at not showing what was underneath. What was underneath was this. 4 years ago, the autumn of 1870, Margaret had been 24 years old, and James Harwood had been 27, and the world had felt, briefly, like it was going to become something. He wasn't a duke yet then. His father was still alive. He was simply James. Charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembered small things you had said weeks ago and brought them up again in a way that made you feel seen. He had sat next to her at 3 consecutive dinner parties that autumn and talked to her. Really talked. Not the performance of conversation that passed for talking in most London drawing rooms. He had looked at her in a particular way. You know the way. You've seen it or felt it. That look that says you, specifically, are the person I want to be in this room with. Margaret had believed it. She had believed it when he left for the continent that November. Business, he said. Family matters. He would be back in the spring. She had believed it when spring became summer and summer became autumn again, and the letters slowed and then stopped. She had told herself there were reasons. She had told herself she was not the kind of woman who fell apart over a man who hadn't even formally declared himself. She had been right about that last part, at least. She hadn't fallen apart. She had simply waited, quietly. The way you wait for something you have decided to trust, even as the evidence gets harder to explain. And then, one morning in March of 1872, she had opened the newspaper at breakfast. The Duke of Harwood, his father having recently passed, announces his engagement to Miss Isabel Courtland, daughter of Lord and Lady Courtland of Bath. The wedding is expected to take place in June. Margaret had read it twice. Then she had folded the newspaper, set it beside her teacup, finished her breakfast. She had not cried, not at the table. Later, in her room, alone, with the door closed, yes, once. But briefly. She was not, she told herself, going to spend more than one evening crying over a man who had not thought her worth the courtesy of an explanation. She had kept that bargain with herself. What she had done instead was work. The committee had come first. Mrs. Pemberton had invited her, and she had said yes because she needed somewhere to put her mornings. Then the reading program at the poorhouse on Vicar Street, twice a week. Then the correspondence work for the parish. Organizing, writing letters, keeping records. She was good at all of it. Precise, reliable, thorough. She showed up when she said she would show up. People respected her for it. They also, she was aware, pitied her for it. There was a particular kind of woman in London society who volunteered extensively and had no husband. And those two facts were connected in most people's minds in a way that Margaret found both insulting and entirely predictable. She didn't say this out loud. She had learned, very carefully, what she could say out loud and what she couldn't. Because the other thing Margaret understood, with great clarity, with the kind of clarity that comes from watching how rooms work for several years, was that she was not allowed to be angry. Other women could be angry. Married women could be difficult, could be particular, could have opinions. But a woman in Margaret's position, unmarried, getting older, already the subject of quiet speculation, could not afford anger, could not afford bitterness, could not afford to say, I waited 4 years for a man who married someone else, and never once wrote to explain himself without every person in the room deciding it was jealousy, smallness, the sour grapes of a woman who had been passed over. So she didn't say it. She smiled instead. She changed the subject smoothly. She showed up to the committee on Thursday mornings and poured her tea and did her work and was, by every visible measure, completely fine. She was not completely fine, but she was upright. She was useful. She was still herself. That mattered more than people knew. And on a Thursday morning in October of 1874, she had been sitting at the committee table perfectly composed, pouring her tea, when the door had opened. And a young woman had walked in, pretty, nervous, new to the city. "Isabel Harwood," she had said. "My husband and I just arrived from London." And Margaret had set her teacup down very carefully and smiled and said welcome. And the whole careful structure of the last 4 years had shifted, just slightly, just an inch, like a house that has been standing on uncertain ground all along and has finally, quietly, begun to feel it. It didn't happen all at once. That's not how these things work. You don't sit down next to a stranger on a Thursday morning and hand them your secrets. It takes time. It takes a few Thursdays of passing the donation lists back and forth, a few afternoons of walking the same direction after the meeting ends, a few cups of tea that stretch longer than they were supposed to. It took about 3 weeks. And then one afternoon, a gray November afternoon, the kind where the light gives up early and the streets are damp and nobody particularly wants to go home to an empty room, Isabel Harwood sat down across from Margaret in the small tea room on Mercer Street and said very quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Margaret said. Isabel looked at her teacup for a moment. "Does it get easier?" she said. "Living somewhere you didn't choose?" Margaret looked at her. "What do you mean?" she asked, carefully. "We came here for James's business interests." Isabel turned her teacup slightly on its saucer. I wasn't consulted, really. He said we were going, and we went. And I don't know anyone here, and I don't know the streets yet, and I spend most of my days in a house that doesn't feel like mine." She paused. "I'm sorry. That sounds terribly ungrateful." "It doesn't," Margaret said. I thought marriage would be—" Isabel stopped, started again. "I thought we would do things together. That's what I thought it would be. I was very young when I thought that." She said it with a kind of rueful lightness, making a joke of herself before anyone else could. Margaret recognized that particular habit immediately. "How long have you been married?" Margaret asked. 14 months? 14 months. Margaret did the quiet arithmetic of that. The engagement, the wedding, the move. 22 years old and already learning to make jokes of herself. "And he is—" Margaret chose her words very precisely. "Is he unkind to you?" Isabel considered this honestly. "No," she said. "Not unkind. Just absent. Even when he's in the room." She looked up. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Margaret said. "It makes complete sense." Isabel seemed to relax slightly, the way people relax when they have said something they were afraid was too strange, and discovered it wasn't strange at all. "Everyone tells me I'm very lucky," she said. "He's a duke. We have a beautiful house. I want for nothing, materially." She said the last word carefully, as if she had only recently learned to add it. "So, I feel I'm not allowed to find it hard." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about standing in front of a mirror in her bedroom in March of 1872, reading a newspaper announcement twice, folding it neatly, going downstairs to finish her breakfast. She thought about the last 4 years of Thursday mornings in smoothly changed subjects and smiles that cost more than anyone knew. She thought about the particular cruelty of being told, "You are lucky when you are not happy." "You are allowed," Margaret said. "Whatever anyone tells you." Isabel looked at her. "You don't think I'm being foolish?" "No," Margaret said. "I think you're being honest. That's harder than it sounds. Something shifted in Isabel's face. A small shift, the way a door opens just slightly when someone finally tries the right key. They sat there a while longer. The tea went cold. Neither of them suggested ordering more. After that, it became a habit. Thursdays at the committee, and then often, not always, but often, tea afterward, or a walk if the weather allowed. Margaret was careful, always, about how much she offered and how much she asked. She didn't push, she didn't pry. She simply was there. Consistent and present and genuine in the way that Margaret was genuine about most things. And Isabel, who had nobody else, opened up the way young women open up when they find someone who listens without judgment and doesn't immediately tell them what they ought to feel. She talked about James. Not in dramatic terms. There was no violence, no cruelty, nothing that would have made for a clean story. It was all much more ordinary than that, and therefore, Margaret knew, much harder to explain to people. He had been different before the wedding, Isabel said. Attentive? Present? He had remembered things she said, brought them up later, made her feel seen. Specifically seen the way you feel when someone is paying attention to you and not just performing attention. Margaret listened to this without moving her face. And after? She said. After, I don't know. It was gradual, like a lamp being turned down slowly. You don't notice it moment to moment, but one day you look up and the room is dark. Isabel looked out the tea room window. He married me because my father's connections were useful. I understand that now. I was 20 years old and I didn't understand it then. Did he tell you that? Not in words? Isabel's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. Men like James don't say these things in words. Margaret looked down at her gloves on the table. No, she thought. They don't. What do you want to do? Margaret asked. Not what you ought to do. What do you want? Isabel looked surprised, as if the question itself was unusual. Perhaps it was. Perhaps nobody had asked her that in a very long time. I want, she started, stopped. I want to feel like a person, she said finally. Not an arrangement. Margaret looked at her across the small tea room table. This young woman, 22 years old, 14 months married, already learning to make herself easy to deal with. Then be one, Margaret said quietly. Regardless of what he does or doesn't do. That's yours. You can't take it. Isabel was quiet for a moment. How do you do it? She said. You seem so settled. In yourself, I mean? Like nothing touches you. Margaret almost laughed. Things touch me, she said carefully. I've simply had practice not showing it. Isabel nodded slowly, as if she was filing this away. They walked home in different directions that evening. Isabel toward Renton Street. Margaret toward the smaller house on Aldgate Lane that had been hers since her father died, and that she had learned, slowly, to think of as enough. Margaret walked the whole way without looking back. She was doing something she had never quite done before. She was helping a woman navigate a man she herself had loved. She was giving the best advice she had, honestly, carefully, with no agenda. She was very aware, not telling the whole truth. And she didn't know yet, she genuinely didn't know, whether that made her good or whether it made her a coward. Perhaps, she thought, turning her key in the front door, it made her both. December came. The committee work got busier around Christmas. More donations, more visits, more letters to write. Margaret and Isabel fell into a rhythm without discussing it. They arrived at the same time on Thursdays, sat near each other at the table, walked out together afterward. The other women noticed and approved, Mrs. Pemberton said once, with great satisfaction. that it was lovely to see Isabel settling in so well. Margaret smiled and agreed. It was, in many ways, genuine. Isabel was. And Margaret had not expected this, had not wanted it, had tried in the early weeks to keep a careful distance. Good company. Sharp when she allowed herself to be. Funny in a dry, understated way that surprised you. She had opinions about things and had learned somewhere along the way to preface them with apologies that Margaret had started quietly interrupting. You don't have to apologize for having a view, Margaret said one afternoon when Isabel had begun a sentence with, I know this sounds foolish, but... Isabel looked at her. Habit, she said. I know, Margaret said. Break it. Isabel had looked at her for a moment with an expression Margaret couldn't entirely read. Then she had straightened slightly in her chair and stated her opinion without the apology, and Margaret had said nothing, just nodded, as if it had always been that simple. Which, of course, it hadn't. But sometimes you have to pretend a thing is simple before it becomes simple. Margaret had learned that too. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-December when it happened. They were not at the committee. It was a day between meetings, and Isabel had sent a note asking if Margaret might like to walk, the weather having briefly and improbably decided to be pleasant. They had walked along the embankment, the river gray and wide beside them, the city going about its business on all sides. They were talking about something else entirely. A book Isabel had found in the house on Renton Street, left behind by a previous tenant. Whether it was acceptable to read a book that wasn't yours if the previous owner had clearly abandoned it. Margaret had said yes, obviously. Isabel had laughed. And then, in the way conversations move when two people are comfortable enough to let them wander, Isabel said, not looking at Margaret, looking at the river, You've lived here a long time. Most of my life, Margaret said. So you know people, the families, the histories? Some of them. Isabel was quiet for a moment. They walked a few more steps. James has people here he used to know, she said, carefully, before we married. He doesn't talk about it much, about his time here. She paused. I sometimes wonder if there was someone before me. Margaret kept walking. Her pace didn't change. Her hands, clasped behind her back, didn't tighten. Her face, turned slightly toward the river, gave nothing. 2 seconds. 3. Most people have a history of some kind, she said, evenly. Yes. Isabel glanced at her briefly. You know how you can feel something without being told? That there's something that happened somewhere that explains why a person is the way they are. Yes, Margaret said. I know that feeling. I asked him once, Isabel said. He said there was nothing worth mentioning. Margaret said nothing. Nothing worth mentioning. 4 years. 4 years of Thursday dinners and particular looks, and a man who remembered small things you said and brought them up later. 4 years of waiting, quietly, for a spring that didn't come. And then a newspaper at a breakfast table. Nothing worth mentioning. Men like James, Margaret said after a moment, very carefully, tend to revise their histories to suit themselves. I wouldn't read too much into what he says or doesn't say about the past. Isabel looked at her. That's an interesting way to put it, she said. It's an honest one, Margaret said. Isabel was quiet for a moment, watching the river. Do you know him? She said. James, I mean. Have you met him at events or... I've seen him, Margaret said. At social things over the years. We've been in the same rooms. All true, every word of it true. Isabel nodded slowly. What did you think of him? When you saw him? Margaret looked at the river. She thought about a dinner party in the autumn of 1870. A man sitting beside her, turning toward her with his full attention, asking about a book she had mentioned 2 weeks earlier, as if he had been thinking about it ever since. The particular warmth of feeling seen by someone you are beginning to trust. She thought about a newspaper, folded neatly beside a teacup. "I thought he was charming," she said. Isabel made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "Yes," she said. "He is that." They walked a little further in silence. "I'm sorry," Isabel said after a while. "I don't know why I'm asking you all this." "You're trying to understand your life," Margaret said. "That's not something to apologize for." Isabel looked at her with that expression again, the one Margaret had started to recognize, the one that meant something was being received in a deeper place than the surface. "You're very good at this," Isabel said, "at saying the right thing." "Not always," Margaret said. "I just try to be honest." A pause. "Are you?" Isabel said. Not unkindly, just curious. "Always honest?" Margaret looked at the river for a long moment. "I try to be," she said. "I don't always manage it." It was the most truthful thing she had said all afternoon. Isabel seemed to take it as modesty. She smiled and said something about the cold coming back in, and they turned away from the embankment and walked toward the city. Margaret walked beside her and said the right things and changed the subject smoothly, and felt, the whole way home, the particular weight of a truth she was carrying alone. She was not lying, she told herself. She was simply not telling everything. There was a difference. She repeated that to herself, walking home in the early December dark. She was not entirely sure she believed it. It was inevitable, really. The city is large, but society is small. And London society in 1874 was very small indeed. The same families, the same houses, the same events rotating through the same calendar year after year, like furniture being moved between the same rooms. Sooner or later, everyone ended up in the same place. It happened at the Ashworths' Christmas gathering. The Ashworths hosted every December a large, loud, well-attended evening at their house on Cavendish Square. The kind of party that was too big to be intimate and too established to skip. Everyone came. Margaret came every year because Mrs. Ashworth was on the committee, and it would have been noticed if she didn't. Isabel came because James had accepted the invitation without telling her until the afternoon of the event. Margaret arrived first. She had dressed carefully, not elaborately. She never dressed elaborately, but carefully. Dark green, her best color. Hair simply done. She knew, without quite admitting she knew, that there was a possibility of the evening she was preparing herself for. She was good at preparing herself. She had had practice. She moved through the rooms, greeted people, said the right things. Mrs. Pemberton found her within 10 minutes and talked for a while about the committee's January plans. Margaret listened and responded and kept, without appearing to, a quiet awareness of the doorway. At 8:30, James Harwood walked in. He was with Isabel. She was in pale blue, pretty, slightly uncertain, the look of a woman at a party where she doesn't yet know enough people to relax. James had his hand at her back, in the way that looked attentive and wasn't. Margaret had seen that gesture before. She recognized it now for what it was. Performance. The correct posture of a husband at a social event. She turned back to Mrs. Pemberton, said something about January, kept her breathing even. He saw her 20 minutes later. She knew the moment it happened because she felt it. That particular shift in a room when someone's attention lands on you. She was talking to a Mr. and Mrs. Forsyth about something she would not afterward be able to recall. And she felt it. And she finished her sentence and turned her head slightly. And there he was, James Harwood, across the room, holding a glass, looking at her. 4 years older, a little broader in the shoulders, the same face, handsome, composed, the face of a man who had always been comfortable being looked at. For exactly 1 second their eyes met. Then he looked away. Margaret turned back to the Forsyths. Her heart was doing something unpleasant. She noted it the way you note weather. Ah, there it is. And continued the conversation about whatever it had been about, and did not look across the room again. He made his way to her eventually. Of course he did. In a room that size, with the history between them, avoiding each other entirely would have been its own kind of statement. It happened near the fireplace, in a brief gap between conversations. He appeared beside her with the ease of a man who had never in his life been uncomfortable approaching someone. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Lord Harwood," she said. "Your Grace," she should have said. He was a duke now. She had said it deliberately, and she watched him register it. A slight thing, barely visible, but there. "It's been some time," he said. "It has," she agreed. A pause. The fire crackled beside them. Around them the party continued. Laughter, glasses, the particular noise of a room full of people performing enjoyment. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." She met his eyes when she said it. Steady, warm enough to be polite, cool enough to be honest. She had practiced this. Not this specific conversation, but conversations like it, in her head over 4 years. All the versions of what she would say if she ever found herself standing beside him again. None of them had gone quite like this. In her head, she had always said more. But looking at him now, she found she had nothing to add. Nothing that would change anything. Nothing that he deserved. So she said "so do you," and held his gaze and let the silence sit there between them, for just a moment longer than was comfortable. He was the one who looked away first. "I hear you've met Isabel," he said. His voice had shifted slightly, lighter, moving away from whatever the previous moment had been. "She mentioned the committee. She's been a wonderful addition," Margaret said. "Very capable." "Yes." Something crossed his face, not quite discomfort, something vaguer than that. "She mentioned you specifically? Said you'd been kind." "She's easy to be kind to," Margaret said simply. James looked at her for a moment. She looked back. And in that look, in that brief, quiet exchange over the noise of the Ashworths' Christmas party, everything that had never been said between them was present. 4 years of it. The autumn dinners, and the particular looks, and the November departure, and the silence that followed, and the newspaper in March, and the 4 years after that. All of it, sitting there between them. He knew that she knew. She knew that he knew she knew. And neither of them said a word of it. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Ellison," James said. "And you, Lord Harwood," she said. He moved away into the party. Margaret stood at the fireplace for a moment, looked at the flames. Then she straightened, set her glass down on the mantelpiece, and went to find Isabel. She found her near the window at the far end of the room, standing with a woman Margaret vaguely knew, looking mildly relieved to be extracted. "There you are," Isabel said, with genuine warmth. "Here I am," Margaret said. "Are you surviving?" "Barely." Isabel leaned slightly closer and said quietly, "I don't know half these people, and the other half keep asking me what I think of the city as if I haven't been here 6 weeks and haven't formed an opinion yet." "Have you?" "Several. None of them polite." Margaret laughed, really laughed, briefly. Isabel looked pleased with herself. They stood together at the window for a while, talking about nothing important, the party moving around them. At one point, Margaret glanced across the room and saw James watching them. Not her. Them. Both of them together. His expression was unreadable. She looked away. Later, much later, walking home in the cold December night, her breath making small clouds in the dark, Margaret thought about that look on his face. That brief, unreadable moment of a man watching his wife talk to the woman he had left behind. She wondered what he felt. She found, to her quiet surprise, that she didn't particularly care. That was new. She found out what he said 3 days later. Isabel told her at Thursday's committee, in a low voice, while the others were distracted with the donation lists. "James mentioned you," she said, "after the party." Margaret kept her eyes on the list in front of her. "Did he?" "He said—" Isabel hesitated. "He said you were one of those women who had never quite managed to find a suitable match." That it was rather sad, he thought. A pause. "He said it kindly," Isabel added quickly. "He wasn't being cruel. Just—" that was how he put it. Margaret looked at the donation list. Never quite managed to find a suitable match. She thought about a man sitting beside her at 3 consecutive dinner parties, remembering everything she said, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. She thought about nothing worth mentioning. "How interesting," she said. "I don't think he meant—" "It's fine," Margaret said. "People say all sorts of things." She smiled and looked back at the list and moved the conversation on with the smooth efficiency she had spent years developing. But she filed it away. She filed it in the same place she filed everything about James Harwood. That quiet, internal drawer she kept locked and rarely opened. It was getting quite full in there. It was a Tuesday in January. Not a committee day, not a walking day. Just an ordinary Tuesday. The kind that doesn't announce itself as significant. Gray sky, cold streets, the city going about its business without ceremony. Isabel had been looking for a document. That was all. Nothing dramatic. James had asked her to find an old letter from his solicitor. Something about a property matter. Something he needed that afternoon and couldn't find himself because he was already late. And could she just look in the study, second drawer on the left, shouldn't take a moment. She had gone to the study. Second drawer on the left. She had found the solicitor's letter immediately. It was right on top, which meant James had either forgotten he'd already found it or had never looked. She picked it up, and underneath it was another letter. Not official, not from a solicitor. Cream paper, small handwriting, the ink slightly faded with age. It had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had gone soft. Isabel was not the kind of woman who read other people's correspondence. She put the solicitor's letter aside. She picked up the cream paper. She told herself she was simply going to look at the signature just to see who it was from, just to know whether it needed to be somewhere else. She wasn't going to read it. She read it. It was from a woman, not a recent letter. Dated the autumn of 1870. 4 years ago. Before Isabel. Before the engagement. The handwriting was careful and precise. The kind you develop when you have been taught that presentation matters. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs. Not a love letter, exactly. But the kind of letter that exists in the space just before love letters, when everything is still tentative and nothing has been said directly, but everything is understood. The woman had written about a book they had apparently discussed, about something he had said at a dinner that she had been thinking about since, about hoping he had arrived safely on the continent. At the bottom, before the signature, one line that was quieter than the rest. I find I'm looking forward to spring very much this year. And then a name. Margaret Ellison. Isabel stood in the study for a long moment. She read the letter again. Then she put it back exactly where she had found it, under the solicitor's letter, in the second drawer on the left. She took the solicitor's letter downstairs. She gave it to James. He said thank you without looking up. She went back upstairs. She didn't come to Thursday's committee. She sent a note, brief, polite, a prior engagement, apologies. Margaret read it and noted the phrasing, and felt, somewhere under her sternum, a quiet shift. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself clearly, but that the body registers before the mind does. She went to the committee, did her work, walked home. Friday passed, Saturday, Sunday. Monday morning a note arrived at Margaret's door. 4 words. Can I come today? No question mark. Which meant it wasn't really a question. Margaret wrote back. Yes. 3 o'clock. She heard the knock at 3 exactly. She opened the door. Isabel was standing on the step in her dark coat. She looked different. Not dramatically. Just the particular way a person looks when they have spent several days carrying something heavy and have stopped trying to pretend they aren't. Come in, Margaret said. Isabel came in. Margaret took her coat, led her to the sitting room. The fire was already going. She had lit it an hour ago, though she hadn't examined why she had done it earlier than usual. She gestured to the chair. Isabel sat. Margaret sat across from her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Isabel said, quietly, looking at her hands, I found a letter. Margaret was still. In his study, Isabel said. A letter from 4 years ago. From before we were married. She paused. From you. The fire made a small sound. Outside, a cart went past on the street. Wheels on the cold stone, and then it was quiet again. Margaret did not look away. She did not explain immediately, did not rush to fill the silence, did not perform surprise or confusion or any of the things that would have been easier. She just sat there and waited. You knew him, Isabel said. Her voice was still quiet, still controlled, but underneath it, something tight, something that had been wound carefully for several days and was now very close to the limit of what careful could hold. You knew him, and you never said. You listened to me, all these weeks, all those conversations, all the things I told you about my marriage. And you sat there, and you knew, and you said nothing. Yes, Margaret said. Isabel looked up. That's all? She said. Yes. You haven't asked me a question yet, Margaret said gently. You've told me what you know. Ask me what you want to know. Isabel looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face, the tight thing pulling. Did you love him? She said. The fire, the street outside, the sitting room, quiet and warm, with its 2 chairs and its ordinary furniture, and the weight of everything that had never been said settling into it like weather. I thought I might, Margaret said. 4 years ago, yes. And he led me to believe the feeling was mutual. Margaret's voice was even, careful and even, the way she had learned to be. He left in November of 1870. He said he would return in the spring. I waited. She paused. In March of 1872, I read about your engagement in the newspaper. Isabel closed her eyes, opened them. He never wrote, she said. Not a question. No. No explanation. No. Nothing. Margaret said. The words sat there between them. Nothing. Isabel stood up. She wasn't dramatic about it. She simply stood the way you stand when you're too full of something to stay sitting, and walked to the window and stood with her back to Margaret, looking out at the January street. A long silence. "All those times," Isabel said, still looking out the window. "All those afternoons. You sat there and you listened to me talk about him. You gave me advice about my marriage, about how to be a person within it, how to hold on to myself." Her voice caught slightly. "And the whole time you were trying to help you," Margaret said. "That part was real." Isabel turned around. "How am I supposed to believe that?" "You're not obligated to," Margaret said. "I can only tell you what was true for me. I didn't tell you because your situation had nothing to do with mine. You came to me with a difficulty, and I gave you the best counsel I had, every word of it honest, every word of it genuinely meant." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. You would assume my advice was contaminated. You would wonder whether I had ulterior motives. You would not be able to hear anything I said without filtering it through what you knew about my history with him." She looked at Isabel steadily. "And I also knew what society would say. That I was a bitter woman trying to poison a young wife against her husband out of jealousy. That everything I did or said was about him." She stopped. "I have spent 4 years trying not to become that story. I was not willing to hand people the material for it." Isabel stared at her. "So you protected yourself," she said. "I protected both of us," Margaret said, "whether you believe that or not." The room was very quiet. Isabel picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. She did it slowly, the way you do things when your hands need something to do. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," Margaret said. "I can't." Isabel stopped, started again. "I don't know what to do with this." "You don't have to know right now." Isabel looked at her. One long, searching look, the kind that is trying to find something specific and isn't yet sure whether it has found it. Then she walked to the door. Margaret didn't follow her. She sat in her chair and listened to the sound of the hallway, the coat being lifted, the front door opening. A pause. Then Isabel's voice, from the hallway. Very quiet. "Was any of it... Did you..." A breath. "Were you my friend? Actually?" Margaret looked at the fire. "Yes," she said. "That was the realest thing in all of it." The front door closed. Margaret sat in the quiet sitting room, in the chair by the fire, with the January light going thin in the windows. She didn't move for a long time. The weeks that followed were very quiet. No notes, no Thursday walks afterward. Isabel still came to the committee. Margaret had half expected her not to, had prepared herself for the empty chair. But she came, and she sat, and she was polite in the careful way that meant she was managing something. They spoke when the work required it. They did not speak otherwise. Margaret did not push. She understood. She had sat in enough difficult feelings herself to know that they needed time and space, and nobody standing over them saying, "But if you would just listen." So she waited. Again. The irony of that was not lost on her. She thought, in those quiet weeks, about whether she had been right. Not about her feelings for James. That question had been settled a long time ago, in a bedroom in March of 1872, in the space of one evening that she had allowed and no more. That was done. But about Isabel, about the choice she had made week after week, to say nothing. She turned it over honestly, the way she tried to turn most things, without flinching, without excusing herself too quickly. Had she been protecting Isabel? Yes. Genuinely. Had she also been protecting herself? Yes. also genuinely. Were both of those things allowed to be true at the same time? She didn't know. She suspected the answer was yes, but that it was the kind of yes that came with a weight attached, the kind you had to carry rather than set down. She carried it. She showed up to the committee on Thursdays. She did her work. She walked home alone. She lit the fire in the sitting room and sat in her chair and read her book, and was, by every visible measure, completely fine. James she saw once, in February. A brief crossing of paths on Harley Street. She was coming out of a bookshop. He was going into a building on the other side. He saw her. She saw him. They were too far apart for it to require anything. A brief nod, the kind you give to someone you have been introduced to at a party, nothing more. He looked, she thought, entirely himself. Confident, well-dressed, comfortable in his own skin. She walked home and thought about nothing in particular. That was progress, she supposed. It was Isabel who told her. A Thursday in early March, 6 weeks after the sitting room, 6 weeks of polite, careful distance. Isabel appeared at Margaret's elbow after the committee meeting ended and said, very quietly, "Walk with me." Not a question. Margaret recognized the tone. She put on her coat. They walked for a while without talking. Down toward the embankment again. The same walk they had taken in December, the same gray river. The city doing its usual indifferent business around them. Then Isabel said, "He has someone else." Margaret looked at the river. "I've known for about 3 weeks," Isabel said. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. She paused. "A widow. She lives in Kensington. He has been visiting her since November at least, probably longer." November, before Christmas, before the Ashworths' party. When he had stood beside Margaret at a fireplace and looked at her with 4 years of unspoken history between them, and then gone back across the room to his wife. "Isabel," Margaret said. "Don't," Isabel said, gently but firmly. "Don't apologize. Don't say you're sorry. I don't want that right now." Margaret closed her mouth. "I want to understand something," Isabel said. She was looking at the river, her hands clasped in front of her voice steady in the way that costs a great deal. "When you advised me, all those months, when you told me to hold on to myself, to be a person regardless of what he did, to not make myself smaller." She paused. "Was that advice about him? Because you knew what he was?" Margaret thought about it, honestly. "Partly," she said. "And partly it was the truest thing I knew, regardless of him." Isabel nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "That last day in your sitting room." A pause. "That it was the realest thing, being my friend." "It was," Margaret said. "I believe you," Isabel said. Margaret looked at her. "I was angry," Isabel said. There are moments when I'm still angry. Not at you now, at him, at the situation, at being 22 years old and already having to learn this particular lesson." She exhaled slowly. "But I kept thinking about everything you said to me, over all those months, and none of it, not a single thing, pointed me toward him. Everything pointed me toward myself." She glanced at Margaret. "A woman who wanted to ruin my marriage would not have done that." The river moved beside them, cold and wide. "No," Margaret said quietly. "She wouldn't have." They walked a little further. "I'm going to speak to a solicitor," Isabel said. "About the marriage, about what my options are." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she had learned to state things without apology. Margaret noticed that, filed it away with quiet satisfaction. "My father will be difficult about it. James will be more difficult. But I think—" She stopped. "I think I would rather have a difficult year than a long and diminishing life." Margaret looked at her. This young woman, 22 years old, 14 months married, who had arrived at a Thursday committee meeting in October, not knowing anyone, holding her gloves in both hands with that look of someone trying very hard not to show they were lost. "Yes?" Margaret said, simply. "You agree?" "Completely." Isabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and there was something different in her voice now, something that was almost under everything, almost light. "You should have told me." "I know," Margaret said. "Earlier. From the beginning. I know. I might have been angry then too, but I would have understood faster." "Probably," Margaret agreed. A pause. "Don't do it again," Isabel said. "Whatever comes next, if we are going to, just don't." "I won't," Margaret said. Isabel looked at her. And for the first time in 6 weeks, for the first time since a sitting room and a closed front door, and was any of it real, she smiled. Small. Tired. But real. "Good," she said. They walked the rest of the embankment in something that was not quite the old ease and not quite something new. Something in between, which is where most real things live. The awkwardness of people rebuilding something carefully, with the knowledge of what it costs to lose it. At the end of the walk, they stopped at the corner where their routes divided. Isabel pulled her coat tighter against the March wind. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Same time Thursday," Margaret said. Isabel nodded, turned to go, then stopped. "Margaret?" "Yes, for what it's worth." She looked back, the wind moving her hair. "I think you were very brave, to say nothing all that time. Not because it was easy, because it clearly wasn't, but because you decided his story wasn't going to be your whole story." A pause. "I want to learn to do that." Margaret stood on the corner in the March wind and said nothing for a moment. "You already are," she said. Isabel held her gaze for one more second. Then she turned and walked toward Renton Street. Margaret watched her go. Then she turned in the other direction, toward Aldgate Lane, toward the small house that had been hers since her father died, and that she had learned, slowly, to think of as enough. And walking home through the cold March afternoon, for the first time in a very long time, she thought, enough might not be the ceiling. It might just be the floor. Let me tell you what happened to James first, because he deserves exactly as much of this story as he earned. Which is not very much. The widow in Kensington lasted 8 months. She was clever enough eventually to see what she was dealing with. A man who was very good at the beginning of things and had no interest in what came after. She ended it quietly, with more dignity than he deserved, and moved to Edinburgh the following year and was, by all accounts, considerably happier. After that there were others. There were always others, with men like James. A pattern once established doesn't break itself. The estate suffered, not immediately. These things never happen immediately. But James was not, it turned out, a particularly careful manager of money. He was good at acquiring things and poor at maintaining them. The Yorkshire properties were mishandled. 2 investments went badly. A third went worse. By 1878, the solicitors were having conversations that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier. He did not lose everything. Men like James rarely lose everything. There is always something left, some floor of privilege that holds even when the rest collapses. But he lost enough. Enough that the rooms in the Renton Street house were quietly closed off, one by one. Enough that the invitations to certain events stopped coming. Enough that when he walked into a room, The air no longer changed the way it used to. He noticed that. Margaret heard through the particular channels that information travels in a small society, that he had mentioned it to someone. That things were different now, that people were different, that he couldn't quite account for why. She could have accounted for it. She didn't. He was not unhappy exactly. He was something duller than unhappy. He was diminished. A man who had coasted on charm and expectation for 30 years and discovered, somewhere in his mid-30s, that charm has a shelf life and expectation runs out. He never wrote to Margaret. She had not expected him to. Isabel's solicitor was a small, precise man named Mr. Cavell, who had, over 30 years of practice, seen a great many situations like hers and had a great deal of sympathy for women navigating them. It took time. These things always took time. The law in 1875 was not designed with Isabel's interests in mind, and her father was indeed difficult, and James was indeed more difficult, and there were months that were very hard in ways that Isabel had not entirely anticipated. But she had said she would rather have a difficult year than a long and diminishing life. It turned out to be closer to 2 years than 1. She managed them. Margaret was there for most of it, not in a dramatic way, not as a rescuer or an advisor or anything with a title. Just there. The way you are there for someone when you have decided they matter. Thursdays at the committee, tea on ordinary afternoons, the occasional letter when Isabel was staying with her family in Bath and needed someone to write to who would be honest. Isabel's father came around, eventually. Not quickly and not gracefully, but he came around. Her mother had always been more sensible and had been quietly supportive from the beginning in the way that women support each other when the men aren't looking. By 1877, Isabel was living in a small house in Bloomsbury that she had chosen herself. It had a garden, not a grand one, just a narrow strip of London garden with 2 rose bushes and a wall with ivy on it. And she had planted things in it in the spring with the focused satisfaction of someone doing something for the first time that should have been available to them all along. She wrote to Margaret about the garden at length. Margaret wrote back that she had strong opinions about roses and would come and share them in person, which she did on a Saturday in May. And they had argued cheerfully about pruning for an hour and a half. And it had been, Isabel wrote afterward, one of the nicest afternoons she could remember. And Margaret. Let me tell you about Margaret last. Because she deserves to be last, the final word, the one you carry out of the story with you. She was 31 years old in the spring of 1877. Society had largely given up on her by then, in the particular way society gives up on women who refuse to be what is expected of them. Not with hostility, just with a kind of baffled withdrawal, as if she had opted out of a game they didn't know how to play without her participation. She didn't mind. She had her house, her committee work, her books. Isabel, who had become, quietly over time, through difficulty and honesty and a walk along the embankment in March, something that Margaret did not have a precise word for, because Friend felt both accurate and insufficient. She had, she realized, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in April, a life. Not the life she had imagined at 24, sitting at dinner parties, believing in particular looks from particular men. That life had never arrived. It had gone to someone else's newspaper announcement and stayed there. But this one was hers in a way that life had never quite been before. Chosen mostly, honest mostly, held together not by waiting for something to begin, but by the daily decision to keep going, keep working, keep showing up to the committee on Thursday mornings and pouring the tea and doing the thing in front of her? She thought about James occasionally, less than she used to, much less. He surfaced sometimes, a name mentioned in passing, a face glimpsed at a distance. And she noted it the way you note old weather. Ah, yes, that happened. And then the day continued. She did not regret waiting for him. That surprised her when she understood it. She had expected somewhere in the long years of it to arrive at regret, to look back and think, what a waste of time, what a cost, what did it take from me? But it hadn't only taken, it had also, and she turned this over carefully, because she was an honest woman, and honesty required acknowledging the uncomfortable things. It had also made her. The waiting and the loss and the 4 years of learning to be upright and useful and real in the absence of what she had hoped for. It had made her the person who could sit across from a young woman in a tea room and say, "You are allowed," and mean it. The person who could carry a difficult truth for months because she had decided someone else's well-being mattered. The person who could open a door on a cold January afternoon and sit quietly and let the hard thing be said and not collapse under it. She would not have chosen it, but she had been shaped by it. And the shape, she thought, was not bad. On a Thursday morning in April, she arrived at the committee to find Isabel already there, which was unusual. Isabel was reliably, cheerfully 5 minutes late. She was at the table with a letter in her hand and an expression Margaret couldn't immediately read. "What is it?" Margaret said, sitting down. Isabel looked up. "My cousin writes," she said, "that there is a position available at a school in Edinburgh, teaching literature." She paused. 2 girls, 12 to 17. She looked at the letter again. Apparently, they are looking for someone with no formal qualification, but significant. She wrote significant personal conviction. A small pause. "I think that might be me." Margaret looked at her. "Edinburgh," she said. "Yes, that's quite far." "It is," Isabel agreed. "It's also quite far from everything I've been trying to put distance between myself and..." She set the letter down on the table. "I think I want to go." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about a young woman walking into a committee room in October, pretty and nervous and holding her gloves in both hands. About tea going cold on too many afternoons to count. About a front door closing in January and the long, quiet months after, and a walk in March, and same time Thursday, sat at a windy corner. "Then go," she said. Isabel looked at her. "You're not going to tell me to think about it carefully?" "You've thought about it carefully," Margaret said. "I can see it in your face. You've been thinking about it since before you got this letter." She looked at her steadily. "Go teach girls literature in Edinburgh. It sounds exactly right." Isabel was quiet. Then she said, and her voice was different, softer than usual, the way voices go when something matters more than composure. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you. I want you to know that." "You would have," Margaret said. "It would have taken longer." "Margaret, Isabel, I'm being sincere." "I know, so am I." Margaret looked at her. "You did the work, I just kept showing up." Isabel looked at her for a long moment. "That," she said quietly, "is not a small thing." The other committee women were arriving now. Mrs. Pemberton, bustling in with her coat half-buttoned, already apologizing for being almost late. The room filling up, the ordinary Thursday machinery beginning. Margaret looked at the donation list in front of her, then at Isabel. "Write to me," she said, "from Edinburgh." "Every week," Isabel said, "whether you want me to or not." "I'll want you to," Margaret said. Mrs. Pemberton called the meeting to order. They both turned to face the table. Outside, through the parish hall windows, the April morning was doing what April mornings do. Uncertain light, the suggestion of warmth, the city waking up into another ordinary day that was not, if you were paying attention, ordinary at all. Margaret picked up her pen and began. She had waited 4 years for the wrong person and found, on a Thursday morning in October, that the right ones had been walking in all along. Not the life she had imagined, but hers. Completely. Finally. Hers. Thank you for being here and following this story all the way through. It means a lot to have you with us until the very end. I hope the story stayed with you in some way, wherever you're listening from. Let us know your city and what you thought about the story. Oskark, we read every comment. We're always working to improve this channel and bring you even better stories. If you'd like to support us and be part of that journey, you can join the channel as a member for a small fee. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.